janky, clunky, dated. A trio of words often used to dismiss old games without really giving them the time of day. And perhaps they'd also be the right words to describe Capcom's first foray into what would later become the highly successful Monster Hunter series. Being the first title in a string of highly iterative games inevitably leads it to be the unfortunate subject of comparisons drawn from its much more polished successors. Yeah, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. Monster Hunter on the PS2 can be a bit rough, but not in ways that inherently grate me. If you've already played plenty of classic Monster Hunter, your experience will just feel like a stripped down, basic version of what you're familiar with, rather than a genuine shock to the system. It's an experience that, because it's lacking in the various quality of life features of its sequels, also requires a change of gears to appreciate. Though, if you do come in with the right mindset to give this game a chance, you're still going to need to prepare yourself for the agonizing, aggravating, and outright anguishing hurdles you'll have to surmount along the way. Which makes this title a bit of a hard sell. Just why would you play this over any other classic Monhun? Especially a Gen 2 game like DOS or Freedom Unite. Hell, why would you play this over Freedom, which is essentially an enhanced port of the G expansion of this very game? At this point, the original Monster Hunter is more like an interactive museum piece, but being so basic compared to its much more expansive successors allows one to experience the essence of the series in its most unadulterated state. At its core, it's still Monster Hunter. Of course it is. This title is the fundamental blueprint to an almost 20-year-old series, but because it's lacking in the amenities the modern hunter will take for granted, it may also seriously test your patience. Fortunately for me, I have a lot of patience. Perhaps, too much patience. The first entry to this now long-running series is a slow-paced outing that demands you become immersed in its numerous mechanics and subsystems. Your base of operations, Kokoto Village, is a quaint and easy-to-navigate place with a pleasant, laid-back BGM. However, you'll find Kokoto is seriously lacking in any sort of convenience you might be used to. The vendor's supplies will leave you wanting. There's no farm, no canteen, no item sets, no gear sets. The blacksmith can't use items from your supply box, and nor can you combine items from within the item box. There's no partner system in this game either, so you'll be packing solo the whole way through. But perhaps that loneliness and constant back and forth within the menus double checking your supplies helps inform the atmosphere of this game. Every interaction requires some degree of deliberation. What surprised me when starting off was how much better this entry does at introducing the player to the various survival aspects of the game, something that's become a bit of a non-factor in recent titles. At this point in the series, those obligatory gathering quests in the early game feel like a routine, but this time, because of the lack of any sort of farm or convenient vendor, being taught how to cook meat, gather various resources, and how to combine them into useful items is indispensable knowledge. Despite already knowing everything the village chief had to tell me, being taught how to do it this time around felt less like going through the motions, and more like a firm reminder of the sort of neighbourhood I was in. You see, you can't even buy a regular potion in this game until you've beaten the village's final urgent quest. Nor are there any dedicated gathering quests. Unlike its sequels, this game demands the player to be much more self-sufficient and proactive when it comes to keeping on top of their supplies. So the process of gathering and stockpiling resources during every hunt is something you should be keeping in the back of your mind. Whenever the target monster runs off somewhere, consider picking up the nearby mushrooms, or grabbing anything else that might be useful along the way. Adequate preparation is expected of the player, and the game isn't going to give you any handouts. Now, I'm sure most people would interpret this as extra busy work, and I don't necessarily disagree, because I'd also rather spend more time fighting wyverns and less time rummaging through weeds, but it does a lot to aid this game's pacing and overall atmosphere. If you treat this game like a slow-paced adventure, in which you learn the lay of the land and soak up the ambience, you might have a good time. Not that it doesn't get painful sometimes, but we'll get into that soon. To elaborate on the ambience, the moment I stepped out of the base camp of the game's starting area, I was immediately greeted with the sense of scale I sorely missed from the more recent entries of this series. While the seamless zones of World and Rise probably present a net gameplay benefit, the divided zones present in classic Monster Hunter allow for these expansive vistas, or pockets of wilderness that give you a sense of a vast locale without having to physically traverse the space in between. That's not to say I haven't largely enjoyed the maps of 5th Gen Monster Hunter, and I feel Rise and Sunbreak's movement mechanics in particular succeed in making the map traversal fun in itself. But there's a show but don't tell aspect to these older maps that sparks the imagination in a way the seamless maps just can't. Wondering what's behind the hills can sometimes be more interesting than actually going there. I remember many of these maps from when I first played Freedom Unite, well over a decade ago. Wait, was it really over a decade ago? When did this game come out? 2009? Christ. But you know, having to run through them again in a game that demands you take your time allows you to see them in a different light. Even in this game, you can see small flourishes and an attention to detail that shows how important expressing the natural world is to Monster Hunter's vision. These aren't just meant to be a bunch of arenas you fight monsters in, but they're habitats, and it's something that's always been a strength of this series from the very first game. Unfortunately, this naturalistic approach means it's not always obvious if something is a gathering point or not. Sometimes, it even feels arbitrary. You're probably going to need to look up gathering maps online to make meaningful headway, because you're likely going to miss at least something here or there. Thankfully, at least the blue mushroom and honey spots are generally easy to spot, which is good, since they're crucial pickups for potions and mega potions that you'll want to make sure you have plenty of by the time you get to 5-star quests. Speaking of quests, there's not many, and a significant chunk of the game is online only. This means you'll be missing out on about a third of the game's roster, without third-party patches or cheat codes. On the other hand, this makes completing Monster Hunter's village quests a pretty succinct experience, and this relatively short length might make the idea of checking out this title a little more appealing, though the variety of monsters you'll be fighting across this journey leaves a lot to be desired. It was early days after all, so there's a lot of the same wyvern skeleton and drones. You won't actually fight your first proper monster until the 2-star urgent quest, which is to say, 1 and 2-star quests are entirely about gathering resources and fighting small monsters, giving you just 11 large monsters to fight across the 3 and 5-star quests. However, don't be surprised to find that the biggest hurdle to your large monster hunts actually ends up being the relentless onslaught of small monsters. From infinitely respawning raptors to herds of tanky bullfangos ceaselessly chasing you down. You'll spend half your hunt tussling with every vertebrate in the vicinity, while the local apex predator is charging at you. Many will bring up this game's egg quests as being a filter, but I genuinely think it's the Gypsaros quest in the swamp, and any other quest in the swamp for that matter, that have the greatest capacity to drive you up the f***ing wall. If you ever pick up this game, you can look forward to having to clear out the group of bullfangos in every zone this guy flies into before you can get around to fighting it. And don't even get me started on the Rathian quest in here. Some monster behaviour can also be outright exasperating. Rathalos' world tour is one thing, but Cephalos outright wastes your time by endlessly swimming around in laps while you chase it around in what feels like an exercise in futility. Gypsaros occasionally charges around in a triangle formation, but will always run to the same spot before doing it, making the entire performance feel overly telegraphed and robotic. Plesioth also loves to swim around in laps while you wait for it to do something. And good god do some of these small monsters get obnoxious. Apsaros in particular are annoying, since despite being really slow, they'll creep up towards you before you know it, and are so big they'll incessantly block the camera until you lose your patience and forcibly remove them. And then after all that effort, you're rewarded with a rather stingy payout relative to the price of equipment in this game. This entire Rathian armor set cost me 36,500 Zedi to make. How much do you think the Rathian quest pays out? Alright then. Don't forget you need to upgrade your weapon too. And God forbid if you want to swap to something else later on. To make figuring out which armor set to make even more of an ordeal, armor skills aren't labelled anywhere on the gear itself. An NPC in the village recommends making gear using the same parts, as in, the same set, and that you'll get bonuses. But you won't have any idea which bonus you'll get until you make and equip the stuff. There's some room here to mix and match equipment from various gear sets here to get more bonuses, but you'll have to look online, or you'll just be pissing in the dark. If you don't know the tricks to making money in this game, trying to afford those later gear sets is going to be an ordeal. Hell, even if you know how to make money, you're still going to have to spend a significant chunk of time acquiring funds. So I'll give you a couple tips. Early on, an easy way to make money is to check the dung piles for a potential Kutku scale. However, this paltry 250 Zeni isn't going to cut it long term. At 4-star, you'll unlock this quest to hunt 30 Vespoid. If you make a weak Poison Sword and Shield, you can kill these guys and the Hornitors who also appear in this quest without disintegrating them. Their carves are surprisingly valuable, and you can make a whopping 9k zenny every half an hour or so, depending how lucky you are. Great, I'll be able to afford my armor set in maybe 2 hours. At best. And that's why I think you need a certain disposition to be able to enjoy this game. Because working up to anything takes a good chunk of time. Perhaps too much time. It's not really surprising that the farm and its variations have become such a staple of the series. Or that simply having enough money isn't something the player has to think about. Perhaps these inconveniences are okay when the scope of the game is so much smaller, but I also feel the newer titles have swung too much in the other direction, and the degree of convenience afforded to the player has eroded at the game essence somewhat. Oh, and I haven't even spoken about the controls yet. Infamously, this game uses the right stick for attack inputs. Let's take the greatsword for example. Tilting up does a forward slash, left or right does an up slash, and down does a round slash, while R1 guards. Greatsword doesn't have a charge slash in this game, so you'll be doing draw slashes and combos. Surprisingly, the guard is pretty useful, and you'll get great mileage out of it. There's only 7 weapons: sword and shield, dual blades, greatsword, hammer, lance, light bowgun, and heavy bowgun, and all of them require you to use the right analog stick to perform actions. Though hammer gets off a little easier since it uses R1 to perform charge attacks. As you'd probably expect, all the weapon movesets are also super basic compared to their later iterations. This whole stick to attack thing tends to be a huge point of contention while discussing the game, but it's not something I really thought about while actually playing. I think anyone talking about it at length is blowing it out of proportion. Objectively speaking, yeah, it's not a great decision, but it's not something that inherently feels bad to use. You get used to it. What might be a bigger point of contention is that because the camera controls are on the D-pad and there's no target cam, you're going to have to claw your controller in order to be able to move the camera and your character at the same time. This isn't such an abhorrent idea to me since I already spent hundreds of hours playing Freedom Unite, and catch myself clawing in other games where it's useful. But since I was emulating, I had to rummage around for a different controller, since the DualSense is simply too thick to comfortably claw for more than a minute. I personally don't mind it, but I can imagine having to contort your left hand to be able to move the camera and your character around at the same time in this fashion might be unpopular to some people. And you're going to have to do it a lot, or you're just going to make the game harder on yourself. So, would I recommend playing the very first Monster Hunter? Well, it's pretty hard to give it a genuine recommendation without bringing up all of its caveats. And the fact that, you know, its sequels are just more of the same, but better. But there's a certain feel this game has that largely hasn't been preserved in the later titles, and a certain pacing some people might appreciate compared to the more modern offerings. There's a grounded, understated atmosphere that becomes rather immersive since you're forced to interact with the environment much more to make ends meet. In the end though, it's a novelty I mostly enjoy my time with, but don't see myself wanting to revisit. But perhaps it's better that way. The brevity of the village quests and officially inaccessible online portion of the game means there's much more of a defined end to this title that makes it easier to put down once you're done, making all those points of aggravation feel more like bumps in the road rather than dents on your psyche. If you want to put a couple dozen hours into a Monster Hunter game and see how it all started, then you might find it worth your time. Otherwise, you'd just be better off playing just about any other game this series offers. There's plenty to choose from, and they've all got their own merits. Special thanks to channel member Electrofunk. If you'd also like to join the channel, I'd appreciate the support. Admittedly, my internet presence has been somewhat thin over the years, but I'm going to try putting out more content on a more regular basis going forward. I've also started streaming regularly on the channel, so come drop by whenever you have the chance. Thanks for watching, and take care.